The church of Sant Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna, dating about 500, represents early Byzantine art and architecture in Ravenna. The church was built by Theodoric the Ostrogoth as his palace chapel and also as the Arian cathedral for Ravenna. As such, it was dedicated to Christ the Savior or Christ the Redeemer. However, after the Byzantine conquest of 539, when Belisarius conquered Ravenna and Italy for the Emperor Justinian, the Arian religion was suppressed. And the cathedral was taken over and rededicated to St. Martin of Tours. Now that is a real slap in the face, because St. Martin of Tours was an anti-Arian bishop. He was known for putting down what he saw as the Arian heresy. Then in the 9th century, it was rededicated to Sant Apollinare. Then in the 9th century, it was rededicated to Sant Apollinare when they transferred the relics of Sant Apollinare from the church of Sant Apollinare in Classe to this church, and they renamed it Sant Apollinare Nuovo, or Saint Apollinare, the new Saint Apollinare. Saint Apollinare was a martyred bishop of Ravenna, so he was a local saint. Sant Apollinare Nuovo is a simple basilica. It has a narthex, or entranceway, and it has a nave flanked by 2 side aisles and an apse. It has no transept. And when you look at the exterior, you can see how the nave rises up and how the side aisle is lower and the narthex is in front. It's just all very, very clear when you look at this aerial view. When we look inside, you'll see that it has an arcade running down the side of the nave, and then a blank wall space where there are mosaics, and then the clerestory, or upper window level, which lets in the light. So it's a 3-part elevation, as we call it. Now, the mosaic decorations on the wall, I should tell you there probably were mosaic decorations in the apse and the triumphal arch, but these were destroyed by an earthquake, and so it's a more recent reconstruction. But along the nave we have 2 sets of mosaics. Above the clerestory, there are these little square scenes that show the miracles and the parables of Christ. And then on the other side, you have the Passion of Christ. The life of Christ, the miracles and the parables, is on the north side of the nave, and the Passion of Christ is on the south side. Between the windows, you have prophets, patriarchs, apostles, and then along that wall area between the clerestory and the arcade, you have a frieze that is the procession of the martyrs. On one side, the women. On the other side, the male martyrs. And here you can see detail of the columns, Corinthian column being reused here. And here the images are a little bit lighter, so you can get an idea of how this frieze shows you the martyrs processing to the altar, in the direction of the altar. Now, a couple of things you're going to notice is some variations on the way that Christ is shown. In the Life of Christ mosaics above the clerestory, Christ wears imperial purple. And he also will be having a nimmed halo. A nimmed halo means that it looks like there's a cross in the halo. Then you have a contrast on the side of the life of Christ, his miracles, his parables. You have the beardless Christ. But with the scenes of the Passion and the Resurrection on the south side, Christ is bearded. So you can watch for these things. Now, one of the questions about these mosaics is which mosaics were created when this was an Arian cathedral, and which mosaics were created or changed when the church became an Orthodox church. And we can't always answer that. There will be some times when we can, and you'll see those, but people argue about it. We're looking now at one of the Life of Christ scenes, and this is shows you the beardless Christ. He's standing in the center, and representative apostles, we've only got 4 here, but they stand in for everybody, are standing behind his arms. And as you can see at the end of one hand, there are the loaves, and at the other are the fishes. So we're seeing the loaves and fishes here. And I brought in the Arian baptistry scene with Paul and Peter. And it's been considered that the style is somewhat similar to the Arian baptistry because the scenes, the style has linear outlines, symmetry, not a lot of action or movement, clarity, simplified forms. But of course, we also see that in Byzantine art of Orthodox churches. So it's possibly done under the Arians and left because there really wasn't anything that wasn't compatible with the Orthodox faith. But once again, we're not sure. So just let's look at some of these. Here we see the calling of Peter and Andrew. And once again, you see the halo with the cross in it, the beardless Christ, Christ in a purple robe, the sign of the emperor. Would that suggest an imperial connection? Well, it may just be Christ is the emperor, the king of the world, whether you're Arian or Orthodox. And of course, you see Peter in the boat, Andrew in the boat. They're fishing, and Christ calls them to be fishers of men rather than of fish. There is some shading here. There's mostly linear shading in the draperies, but in the garment of Christ, it seems to me there's a little more sense of three-dimensionality in certain parts. And you actually have a little scene that shows the sea and the figures that are placed back. So although most of these are very simple with very limited space, every once in a while you see something that suggests a bit more space. We were already talking about the miracle of the loaves and fishes, very symmetrical. The loaves and fishes seem to hover there, suggesting, I guess, that that is a miracle. Of course, what Christ does is take a very few number and divide them into a feast for 5,000 people, which essentially is a great miracle. The Last Supper is a very interesting image. This, of course, is on the side with the Passion of Christ. The Passion of Christ refers to his suffering. The word passio in Latin means suffering. So the suffering of Christ at the end of his life and at the crucifixion, of course. So we're seeing what leads up to that, the Last Supper. And you have the bearded Christ with the imperial purple robes, once again. Instead of a paschal lamb on the table, you're showing fishes and loaves. So it's a little unusual that way. Also, you're not seeing a chalice. You're not seeing, the loaves, of course, could refer to as the bread of the Eucharist. But the fish, you may remember, was a symbol for Christ. That the letters that spell out fish were the first letters of Jesus Christ, Lord and Savior in Greek. So I was counting apostles. I'm counting 11 apostles rather than 12, which is kind of interesting. Did he just leave one out? Am I counting wrong? And does that mean that Judas has already departed? Or is the profile figure opposite Christ Judas? There is a tradition of placing Judas opposite Christ at the Last Supper, and often showing Judas in profile, so he's not looking at the viewer, so they're not getting the evil eye. You can see it's a semicircular table with Christ and the apostles reclining. And of course, in the Roman world, you would recline on couches rather than sit up at chairs or benches, which we see in later art. The mosaic in Sant Apollinare Nuovo bears a resemblance to some other Last Suppers that we've seen. For example, the semicircular table is very similar to the scenes of the banqueting in catacomb paintings. And also in the 6th century Rossano Gospels, so approximately at the same time as Sant Apollinare Nuovo, we see a Last Supper with Christ and 12 apostles. Similar in some ways. You have your semicircular table. You have Christ and the apostles reclining. The decorations are a little bit different, hanging down from the couches and the table. And instead of the fish, we see a large vessel, a large chalice in the center of the table. And in this case, we can identify Judas. He's not the figure on the end, but we can identify Judas because he is the one, when Christ announces that one of the apostles will betray him, they all want to know who it is. And he says, "It is he to whom I give the sop." And so sometimes what you'll see is Judas reaching out with the morsel of bread to dip it in the wine, the sop. And in some cases, as you see here, he's greedy. He's the first one to take the food, seems to be the implication. And there's another catacomb painting. We're looking here at the betrayal of Christ. It's not tremendously dramatic because except for Judas, everyone is standing very erectly and seemingly very quietly. The soldiers in colored tunics are sort of crowded together on one side. One of them reaches over to arrest Christ. And then the most dynamic figure actually is Judas. And he leans forward to betray Christ with a kiss. Christ is in the center. He's larger than the other figures, which shows his importance. And of course, the purple robe also shows his importance. And the apostles just seem to be standing around, but you'll notice that Simon Peter is fingering a sword. And you may remember from the Gospels that he actually does fight back, and he cuts off the ear of one of the soldiers, or the soldier's servant, and then Christ has to heal it. So there is a reference to some dramatic action that isn't actually seen here. Now, it's interesting, in this case you have all of these hard outlines. So everything seems to be outlined. But within the draperies, you still can find shading. In other words, you'll have a darker line of tesserae, and then a section where you have sort of a middle ground, and then there'll be the highlights. With the apostles, the highlights are in white. And here, Christ is led to execution, the way of the cross. Once again, he's still larger than the other figures. He's more important. And you're seeing Christ in imperial robes. You're seeing him with the nimmed halo. You're seeing him always in control. We're not seeing the Christ suffering. That comes in later in art. Sometimes people suggest that, well, that emphasizes Christ's divinity, so maybe these should be Orthodox scenes. But if we've already seen, they could also be Arian scenes. I don't know that there's any way of proving exactly when these were created.